Hey Wargamers, Doug here. Before this video starts, I wanted to throw a little shout out to a project that I'm working on. You see, I am going full time into content creation, almost doubling what I know I can put out in a given week. But to do that, I need a new camera and some setup and some hardware, and so I started a GoFundMe. In the description down below, you can find a link to it. There's also a video next to that where you can find more details, and I kind of go into a lot more explanation of how it all works. And of course, on the GoFundMe page, there's detail as well. So please consider donating. Me and the patrons are all very excited about this next step for the channel, and it just means more content for you guys. So anyway, think about it, and I'll catch you later. Welcome back, Wargamers, to the Mortal Realms, and you're just in time because if you listen closely, you can hear the bell toll for Anvilheim as the unending menace that is the Skaven race sets their collective sights on a bastion of order. My name is Doug, and today we're talking about the story Anvilheim Devoured. The Anvils of Heldenhammer lead a war of reconquest that purges the slaves of darkness from the kingdom of Ulhor. Little do they know that, though the taint of chaos may be gone from the surface, the Skaven war barrow of Lurkspine Deeps remains below the surface. The Ratmen bide their time, watching with avaricious eyes as the forces of order raise a rich city, Anvilheim, above their tunnels. 13 years to the day after the first foundations of Anvilheim are laid, the Skaven tide pours up from below. Verminous claw hordes storm up the culverts and sewers to spill through the streets. Plague smog billows, gas-masked scryer acolytes dashing through it to hurl their poisonous bombs at the city's reeling defenders. The Anvils of the Heldenhammer, the Free Guilds, the Ironweld Arsenal, even the Order of Azir all make spirited attempts to drive the Skaven back, but they are surrounded, outnumbered, and caught completely by surprise. When a coven of Greyseers summons Screech Vermin King himself to lead the final assault, the defenders of Anvilheim are doomed. Now I want to start here with a bit of a gush. Okay, the first rules book I bought from GW, apart from my Warhammer Fantasy Battles High Elf Army book, was End Times Thanquol. Of course, a very popular, Skaven character, and in that book, the human city of Nuln is obliterated in possibly the coolest way ever. And this story just sparks those memories, and I love it. So let's break this down a bit, starting with the setting. Now, we don't know much about the city of Anvilheim. We know it was founded by the Anvils of Heldenhammer, and as we'll talk about them in just a minute, obviously, but the founding Stormcast chambers tend to kind of set the mood for a city, right? It's their values that they're passing on to the citizens and the leadership and that kind of thing. And although it's given a region, the Kingdom of Ulhor, I actually couldn't find it on any map, so if you see it, leave in the comments down below and I will pin it for us. But I think it's very fair to say this was an established city. Chaos was driven out over a decade before this story really begins. It has a permanent group of Stormcast Eternals stationed there. There's also a Free Guild regiment, Order of Azir, the Ironweld Arsenal, all these things. There's just a lot going on here. And if a resource-rich location was acquired, I don't think 13 years is unreasonable at all for a quick city to pop up, especially if it was an earlier one, where the cities of Sigmar forces were basically waiting in Azir for a chance to burst out and claim some land. But having a city with a real military presence like what's described also means things like trade caravans, supply lines, communication. Again, this is no small city is kind of my whole point. And of course, while all the slaves to darkness or chaos mortals are driven out, it's the underground network of tunnels that go unseen. And so I think this is a great way to segue into talking about the forces at play in this story. And I'll start with the forces of order so we end this section talking about kind of the main faction, right? This is from the Skaven book, so this story is really dominated by the presence of three factions. The Anvils of Heldenhammer, which of course is a Stormcast Eternal Chamber, the Free Guild, and Ironweld Arsenal. Now, the Free Guild and the Ironweld Arsenal can really be written to be anything, right? They don't have a specific history or heraldry. They're more of a representative of a military role than a direct set of soldiers. But we actually know quite a bit about the Anvils of Heldenhammer. This is one of my absolute favorite storm hosts because of their unique origins. You see, while other storm hosts are made up of souls that were plucked in their last moments, alive, often fighting amongst chaos during the Age of Chaos specifically, the Anvils of Heldenhammer are ancient souls of mighty heroes pulled from Shyish. They were long dead before the events of the Age of Chaos, and basically existed in Shyish as spirits. Now, I'm sure as the war has gone on, new soldiers can be made and added, but at least the initial Stormcast Eternals of the Anvils of the Heldenhammer all had this in common. And as Stormcast, they no longer have to fear death, right? They've tasted it, been conscious for a long time in Shyish, and so they have this perspective on life and death that is wholly unique to them. They often act like people out of time, right? They're just kind of in the wrong place. They have archaic languages and traditions and battle rites and things like that. There's a big emphasis within that Stormhost on remembering the old ways as they would see it. They are extremely quiet and grim, but equally honorable and good. And I've actually touched on these guys earlier talking about Anvilguard, and one thing that keeps coming up is that when a storm host founds a city, that place tends to take on some of their personality. So a Hallowed Knight fortification would lean towards being more of a religious-focused place, but here the Anvils of the Heldenhammer seem to make places dark and gloomy, but very stable. And of course, while Anvilguard is probably a bad example of stability due to the shady criminal organization that's present, keep in mind that there's so much more to a people and culture than the crime happening within it. And so, while we have no real description of the city, when I think of a location that's defined by the Anvils of Heldenhammer, I think of things like eerie stillness or a thick fog. It's kind of gloomy all the time in terms of people's temperaments, kind of dour folks live there. They have strong, reinforced walls with, long forgotten heraldry all over them. And of course, none of this is canon or written out expressly. I'm just letting you know where kind of my brain is thinking about headed when I think about this city. So there's the cities of Sigmar and the Anvil's forces, but that's not who this book is about, right? This story comes from the Skaven battle tome, and I love these guys. See, 13 is a very special number to the Skaven. It is the holy number of their deity, the Great Horned Rat. And so 13 years to the day that the forces of order drew the line in the sand, the Skaven crossed it. Exactly who decided this needed to wait 13 years is anyone's guess, but it makes for one heck of a story. Now, Skaven are always a bit of a hard one to cover because they're pretty well separated into various clans like Scryer, Pestilence, Mulder, and so on, but the way that the faction as a whole lore-wise functions is that these clans sell their services to one another, and so a warlord or Grayseer might have some smattering of troops from all over the place, which is exactly kind of the case that we're talked about in this story. It makes it a bit difficult to cover because all of a sudden you have to pull lore from all these different clans and kind of cover everything, so it can be a bit much to talk about. Well, here we have elements of Grayseers, who are the gifted wizards of the Skaven race. You have Scryer acolytes hurling gas-filled grenades, and a demon named Screech Vermin King who is summoned. Now, Screech Vermin King is kind of like the chosen demon of the Great Horned Rat. So, for example, Tzeentch has Kairos Fateweaver, and Khorne has Scarbrand, right? This is his number one guy for the Great Horned Rat, as far as demons go specifically. A full embodiment of the Great Horned Rat amongst the realms. And the specific forces involved here are, to me, secondary to the scene when it comes to the Skaven. Like, I imagine this as a normal, calm day, but the ground starts to bubble up, almost like there's an underground geyser that's about to burst. Then there's a huge boom and a massive sinkhole appears and opens up inside the city walls. And there's chaos and panic, but at first, this could be a totally natural disaster, but then there's this deafening sound of chittering and claws scraping against rock and stone and metal, as a green, thick cloud slowly rolls out of this hole. And before the citizens are ready, gas grenades are being hurled, clan rats are pouring up from the sewer lines around the city, Grayseers are firing arcs of lightning. All these things are happening incredibly fast and aggressively. And so if you live there, what do you do, right? Assuming you weren't swallowed up by this huge initial breach of the hole in the ground, there's just Skaven everywhere. Where does the counterattack come from? Like, where do you start to form up? What are you fighting towards or falling back to? It would just be absolute pandemonium. And this crazy scene is what kind of enraptures me in awe. Like, I'm not talking that these specific units of Skaven mentioned are like super awe-inspiring, but the way that they conduct war, it just seems so overwhelming and such pandemonium. I just absolutely love it. That's honestly why I like Skaven so much, is thematically what they are doing is terrifying in scale, but just awe-inspiring at the same time. And I imagine that there are places in Anvilheim that would be more secure, right? Where, defensive lines could be made. So places like, obviously, if there's like a town hall or a free guild barracks or whatever, chamber or, building or structure the Stormcast Eternals have there. At no point does the story say, and the battle went back and forth and it swayed and we never knew who was going to win. Like, it says the defenders tried their best, but the final nail in the coffin was Vermin King showing up. Though at no point did things ever, look good for the good guys, right? They were outnumbered and surrounded. The walls were already infiltrated by the time the actual assault starts. It was just a mess from the beginning. It's fun, it's engaging, it's the kind of story that works for both the crazy, the over-the-topness of AOS, because the scale of this kind of underground drilling is just bizarre, right? But it really does push that old world button for me that I mentioned earlier, because this is kind of the same battle that took place in Nuln, with a few key differences, of course, but you can see how this sets up for a very interesting campaign. And so how do we bring these events to the table? That's always the kind of harder question here. The only thing I can really comment on when it comes to the table itself, as far as creating the scene, is to try and build some form of city if you have the terrain. And that could be something like, maybe if you only have a few buildings, put them to one side and then have farmland on the other or something like that, but something where the idea is to be inside a city. Now, frankly, we don't know what realm they are in, so that's totally up to you. Again, I couldn't find the Anvilheim in a specific realm, so if you do, leave in the comments below and I'll pin it, just kind of go off that. Nor do we have any real kind of geography, I can't tell you that it's near water or mountains or anything like that. So there's a lot of freedom when it comes to designing a narrative table for this setting. But let's talk about the armies. Now, there weren't a ton of units on the Forces of Order side called out, but I got some guidelines for you if you wanted to recreate this. I would say either, as far as allegiances go, play as either Stormcast Eternals or Cities of Sigmar, or both, because you can take Stormcast Eternals in your Cities of Sigmar army. But we can add a little bit more detail here, right? The story doesn't say which part of the city the Skaven burrowed up into. So that's something you and your opponent can craft, and then pick forces that reflect that. So, was it near the Stormcast garrison? Then I would probably lean heavier into the Stormcast Eternals. Was it near the Free Guild barracks or an armory? Then you can kind of build your list and lean into Free Guild or Ironweld arsenal, respectively. Basically, all I suggest is picking a force that reflects what you think Anvilheim would be defended with at that location. And be sure to include or make a named hero or that kind of thing for your defense, right? It could be a Stormcast Eternal Lord or a Free Guild General. It doesn't matter, right? Really what I'm asking is, who is the central figure of this dramatic defense, right? Who is running around trying to rally people and make survival a possibility? Those are the greatest stories ever. Now on to the Skaven, and honestly, there's only a small handful of units that are specifically mentioned. We have Acolytes, which are a fantastic unit, Greyseers, and Screech Vermin King, but like I said, these warlords will hire all manner of Skaven to achieve their goals. So I can't tell you, these are the units you should fill your army with, but I will say leaning into Scryer, Clan Rats, and a Greyseer makes utter and complete sense. So what about a battle plan? Well, I really honestly struggled with this one quite a bit. I would say more than any other of these lore videos that I've done, because we're not really talking about a single point of contact that you can represent on the table, but rather a series of events that go from bad to worse for the defenders. The point is, this story does not scream battle plan to me, it screams campaign. And one campaign has all the rules designed and ready for you in the General's Handbook 2019, and it's called The Battle for Alexia. This mini-campaign format, where you use a form of open war army generators, though you can do whatever you want in terms of points and that kind of thing, pits one force of order against basically any other kind of invader. And so the thematic element of this is these are quick, short, brutal games that are representing a attacker force, in this case the Skaven, pushing back the defenders to various parts of the city. And so you and your opponent, even though narratively the defenders keep getting pushed back, which, you know, fits with the story perfectly, they do still have a chance to win the campaign. So that might represent something like making sure the women and children are able to escape, or stopping supplies from getting here, or something like that. And what I love about this is that it really represents several moments. If you look at the battle plans, I believe there's 5 in the Battle for Alexia section here. There's the initial attack, the getting pushed back around important locations like temples and the armory and all that kind of stuff, and a final stand of sorts. But this works for our story because you can save Screech Vermin King for that last game, and that's exactly what happens in that story. The Skaven all attack, but during the assault, the Grey Seers summon in Screech, and so having this progression narratively of like, we can really represent the escalation of what's going on here and just how in trouble, we'll say, the defenders are. It's very simple. You play 3 games. The Skaven player would probably switch up their forces every match. The defender can have a regiment of renown and keep falling back. And the Alexia campaign stuff is designed to be fast and brutal, so knocking out an awesome story in an afternoon is really not unreasonable at all. And if you want to go really hard, you can use the Streets of Death campaign rules from the same General's Handbook, and that simulates things like Skaven using sewers to get around the city, or setting buildings on fire, or narrow passageways through different structures in a city. There's all kinds of great resources in that General's Handbook. And honestly, like I was looking around at making my own battle plans, and I was looking around at various ones that have already been made, and I'm just like, all I'm doing is just retreading the same ground that this has done. So I would say have a look at the Battle for Alexia campaign series, and you can modify it as much as you want. For example, they suggest to make the games short and quick, taking like the open war generator forces. You can do it, you cannot, it's totally up to you. There's actually a really interesting balance system for that campaign that involves those that I think you might want to check out. But regardless, no matter how you play it, I think this is a really cool story. It was one of my favorite things in the old world when Nuln fell, because they had the same thing, the big bubble in the earth, and it crashed down. And then in that story, it was whatever the big bell was, the screaming bell came up, and like as it was dinging 13 times on the 13th, the city crumbled, or, you know, all this kinds of crazy thematic stuff. It's totally Skaven. It's absolutely fun, and I would really love to try a little mini campaign with this set. Again, like I said, the Battle for Alexia is meant to be short and brutal, so you can do a campaign in a day very, very reasonably. So go ahead and check it out and let me know how it goes. And friends, thank you all so much for joining me through this Age of Sigmar lore video. I look forward to catching you in my next one, and happy wargaming. Hey everybody, I hope you enjoyed that video. It was made possible by the folks over here to the left. These are my top supporters over here on YouTube and on Patreon that keep this channel going. If you'd like to learn more about how to become a supporter and get some cool things in the process, like exclusive pictures and interactions with me, and get your questions answered here on the channel, go ahead and click any of the links down below or the join button on the community page over on YouTube. Regardless of your choice, I wanted to thank you so much for joining me with this video, and I look forward to seeing you in my next one. Happy wargaming.